So for those of you who like to know what's ahead and what's coming, we've kind of already mentioned today we're in the book of Acts. We've been here over the last few weeks just following through our teaching series on this New Testament book. Next Sunday, as has been mentioned, is our student takeover Sunday, and then after that is Father's Day, which we're going to be in an Old Testament passage for that Sunday, and then we're kind of into some vacation and some things that are going on. We will come back to Acts chapter 18 in the middle of July at some point, but for this morning, we're going to spend our time in this passage and actually right through to the end of the chapter. Now, we do have a lot to cover today, and I hesitated to even preach the whole passage. I thought we should break this up into maybe a couple different messages, but I didn't kind of want to span them so far apart. And so here's what's going to happen. I'm going to preach the whole text today. I will not hold you hostage until 2 this afternoon as we do so. That's my promise to you. But there's going to probably be some things that we're not going to quite get to or that might rise to the surface out of the passage. I'm going to try to cover all the most important highlights and things that I think are helpful for us today. But there's a lot of stuff I've even left off that I find really interesting or think, hey, would be great to bring this to light. But we'll probably leave some things behind as we work our way through Acts chapter 17. And so if you haven't been with us, where are we in the book of Acts? So the book of Acts is the story of the early church written by Luke, the same Luke who wrote the gospel according to Luke. The gospel is the account of Jesus' life and ministry from his birth to his death and resurrection. The book of Acts chronicles about the first 30 years of the history of the early church. And so we start in Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria and then eventually to the end of the earth. And so where we find ourselves now is along with the Apostle Paul as well as Silas and Timothy and those who are with them on their second missionary journey. And this is the first time that they have kind of gone into Europe and into what is Macedonia or Greece, we would call it now. This is the first time they have gone into that territory to tell others of the good news of Jesus. And so when they first got to Greece, they went to Philippi, and you remember the story there where they were thrown in prison because there was some dust kicked up by some people in the city. But then they were released from prison eventually, and they were asked to leave the city. And so they left Philippi. They went to Thessalonica. And when they were in Thessalonica, there were some Jews who got really jealous of them because of the message that they preached. And some people were coming to believe the message. And then they stirred up the crowd in the city. And Paul was forced to leave with Silas and Timothy under the cover of darkness of night for their own safety. They went to Berea, which is now 70 kilometers away. And when they get to Berea, we read that the Jews in Berea were more noble than those in Thessalonica. That is to say, not that they were more noble in terms of their social status, but in terms of their open-mindedness to what it is that Paul and Silas and Timothy were telling them about the scriptures and about Jesus. And the people in Berea actually took the time to examine the scriptures to see if what Paul was teaching was true. Because when he showed up to the synagogue, he would say, hey, we have this common space that we start with in terms of faith and our understanding of things and who God is and who we are. And so he starts with the scriptures that they believe to be authoritative, and he starts there and says, hey, all of this points to Jesus, who is our Messiah, who has fulfilled all of these things. And so the Bereans would examine the scriptures every day to try to figure out, hey, is what Paul telling us actually true? But while they were in Berea, some of the Jews who were in Thessalonica followed them there. And when they got to Berea, these Jews also stirred up trouble in Berea. And to that point, well, here's where we left off last time. Verse 14 of chapter 17 says, then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way by sea, to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. And so Paul, the one to whom the main opposition seems to be against, they sent him away. They said, Paul, you gotta keep moving. Silas and Timothy, we'll stay here. We'll continue the work. The ministry will continue even though there is some opposition, but Paul, we feel it's best that you kind of keep going. We'll catch up with you eventually. And so Silas and Timothy stayed there, but those who conducted Paul, that is those who were going to help him and escort him away, they brought him as far as Athens. And after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, those who brought him there left to take that message back to Silas and Timothy to say, hey, we're going to get you to Paul as soon as it's possible or feasible. And so Paul is left in Athens. Now, he's got there by sea. And so I've kind of put a little map for you. You can kind of see that top circle is Berea, where it is. Thessalonica is just to the right of it, as you can see. So he's come all the way down to the end of Greece where Athens is kind of near the bottom. Now, Athens is referred to as the birthplace of democracy, whereby equality and justice are thought to be part of the governing authority through representation of the people. And so it was in Athens that 40 times a year that 500 men would gather to decide foreign and domestic policy. And this is kind of where our understanding of democratic government and democratic representation came out of. And in fact, it's out of that group, there's a story that's attached. You remember Socrates? Anybody from their philosophy class in school maybe? Or you've heard at least the name Socrates before. It's this group that actually condemned Socrates. They believe that he had corrupted the youth of the day because he was critical of the elders and skeptical of all of the gods. And so that was Socrates' view. And so they put him to death in a state prison by forcing him to drink hemlock. That's what happened to Socrates. So this is part of the history of all of these things in Athens. But the city is known not only as the birthplace of democracy, but it's known for its academics, it's known for its art, for its architecture, its philosophy, its religious devotion. And probably one of the most famous things that if you think about Athens, this is probably the picture that comes to mind. It's a picture of the Acropolis. And that sits up on this citadel in the city, which basically means a high point in the city. And on top of the Acropolis were all kinds of buildings of significance in the city of Athens. If you go there today, it currently hosts the remains of multiple buildings that extend as far back to as 7 BC. That's where some of these pieces are. And so this is the city in which Paul finds himself. He is in Athens. And what follows, and part of what Mark read for us today, is one of the most famous stories in the book of Acts. Here's how it goes. Paul was waiting for them at Athens. But while he's waiting, something happens. His spirit is provoked within him by what he saw. Now, I don't know when the last time you stood around or sat around waiting for something was. I don't know what you do when you wait for things. It probably depends on the circumstance. But if you have any extended time that you're going to wait for something, you might have a book with you. Emma loves to have a book with her wherever she goes. She'll read and she'll sit and read all kinds of things. I don't know how many books you read this past week, 6 or 7 maybe in the last week or two. Emma loves to read. Carolyn does the same thing. She'll often have a book when there's some downtime. Maybe if you're waiting, if you're in town, you might go to grab a coffee somewhere and just kind of sit. Maybe you're the kind of person who will doom scroll on your phone while you're waiting, and nothing of value comes of it, but you do it anyway every time, because it's how you pass the time. Maybe if you're waiting, you love to wait at the beach, you'll just go there and we'll take a walk, or we got some spare time. Whatever you do when you're waiting. Well, Paul is waiting in Athens. He could have taken a break. He could have rested up. It's been a kind of a ministry season that's been full of all kinds of dangerous things and busy things and hard things. And so he could have just rested up somewhere. He could have gone sightseeing. I mean, there's lots of things to see, but that's, I guess, kind of what happens. He sees some things while he's in the city. But when he sees those things, his spirit is provoked or stirred up. Why? Because the city was full of idols. And in Athens, that was very much the case. There are all kinds of statues and shrines and altars and temples to various gods. And they were just everywhere. The whole city, and not just the city, but that represented a culture that was just flooded with all kinds of deities and perspectives and what we call polytheism. So many gods. Poly meaning many, theism, gods, many gods. So polytheism, this was part of what happened and what the culture was like there. And this provoked something in Paul. He sees all these idols and shrines and altars and things. There is even in Athens, now get this, there was also, so among all the various temples and things to Zeus and to Apollo and all kinds of different gods, there was also even a shrine to effort, which is interesting because that's just literally a concept that's not even attached to any divinity in a polytheistic worldview. There's a shrine to effort. And so it's like there were altars and shrines to all kinds of things in this city, and this provokes Paul. And so what does he do? He doesn't rest, he reasons in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons. Now, to reason is not to give a speech. To reason is not to grab a bullhorn. To reason is not to kind of, I've come and I'm going to give my 5-minute presentation and that's it. No, to reason is to dialogue. It's a back and forth. It's to ask questions and respond to questions. That's what it is to reason. And so what does he do? He reasons in the synagogue with the Jews, as he often would, and the devout persons. But not only that, but also in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. Now, the marketplace, interestingly enough, was located on the north side of the Acropolis. The picture that we just saw with all of the temples and various buildings there. And so the marketplace was on the north side of that. Paul was walking around the marketplace, and even in the marketplace was an altar to the 12 gods. And so it was just everywhere. And so he would talk. We get the sense that he would just strike up a conversation with anybody who would listen. And not only Jews in the synagogue, but also just with people who are out shopping on that day. So here he is in the city, provoked by all this thing, trying to reason with people, trying to ask questions, trying to see if there's an opportunity for a gospel witness. And as he does, he runs into some philosophers, the Epicureans and the Stoics. Now, let me just kind of bring you around their way of thinking just for a second. And again, this is one of those things, if I had time as we kind of would break down Paul's message later on, we would see how some of the things he says are kind of directly confronting some of the ways of thinking of the Epicureans and the Stoics, which I won't point them all out today, but this is important for us that he runs into some philosophers, some thinkers. Now, who were the Epicureans and the Stoics? Well, some of you know Epicurean because you've heard of epicure spices, which I don't think exists anymore. You might have some in your cupboard, but we had this amazing lemon dill spice that we used to use to make a really great dip with. I know not a great thing to say right before lunch, but this is not that epicure. The Epicureans, some of the kind of pieces of their view of things, their view of the world was this: that the cosmos or the universe happened or was part of an accident. Sounds vaguely familiar to some other lines of thinking. They believed that there was no providential God who was kind of God over all of the gods and over all the affairs of human beings and over the universe. That just didn't happen. To enjoy the good life meant to seek pleasure in every opportunity that you could enjoy pleasure. And so that was the view. There's no providential God. The good life is all about seeking pleasure. We might call that hedonism. And that the whole universe was just simply an accident. That's the Epicurean view. The Stoics, on the other hand, had some different views of things. The Stoics believed that the highest good that we could attain to is to pursue virtue. If we can the good life was not pleasurable, the good life was a virtuous life. Emotions were very bad. That's why when we talk about Stoics, they're very stoic, reserved, right? We don't express a lot of emotion. We don't feel a lot of emotion. We kind of maybe even suppress those emotions. Why? Because they're bad. We accept things as they come. We call reality what it is because whatever will be, almost a fatalistic determination point of view in terms of the world. And as well, it was pantheistic in that the belief was that when people died, that part of them was absorbed back into the divine. And so just we all kind of came back into the same space in the end in terms of, anyway, that's probably not the best description of pantheism, but that's, when you died, you were just kind of absorbed back, your spirit was absorbed back into the divine. So we have these two worldviews that Paul comes into confrontation with, or at least in terms of his question and reasoning. And so the Epicureans and the Stoics, who are philosophers in the city, conversed with him, and they said to him, what does this babbler wish to say? Now, if it sounds a bit offensive, it's probably because it is. Babbler was a derogatory kind of term. It was one that means a loafer. Or a scrap collector, a peddler. That's the kind of idea. So what is it that he wishes to say to Athens? Others said, well, he seems to be preaching about foreign divinities. Divinities are gods that don't belong to us, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And so what happens? Well, in verse 19, it says, they took him and they brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting, because you're bringing some strange things to our ears, and we want to know what these things mean. We want to hear you on what you have to say. Now, again, the Areopagus was at the council. There was a council that dealt with the important matters of the city, and this included issues of religion and education. And so it was dangerous to show up to the Areopagus, because while they would be open to new things, you were not permitted to deny the accepted things. Remember Socrates? Okay, so here's Paul. He's brought to the Areopagus, and they say, hey, we're interested of some of what you have to say, but we are skeptical at the same time. And then I love this verse. It's kind of a neat little summary in verse 21 that says, now all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there would spend their time in nothing except telling and hearing of something new. We love to just sit around and shoot the breeze. We love to just sit around and talk. You know, when I was growing up, my grandfather owned a general store right across the road. My uncle came to own it. I worked there. I think I was 10 years old when I started. $2 an hour I got. Did all kinds of stuff there. But we sold everything from groceries to Yamaha pianos and bed frames, and like it was literally a everything store. And so the thing is that we live in a farming community, and in the summer it'd be very busy and there'd be tourists and everything come by. But in the winter, we put the coffee on, and especially on Saturdays, there had to be at least 6 stools that were in the building somewhere, and all the farmers would come on Saturday morning. And it was winter, and so there wasn't as much for them to do in the winter. And they would come, and they would each have a stool, and we'd have the coffee on, and they'd pour a cup of coffee in their little styrofoam cup. And then they'd be smoking cigarettes, you know, in the store. Like, I just did that day. And so I probably got more secondhand smoke just from Saturday mornings at the store. But here they were, and they'd drink their coffee, and they'd smoke their cigarettes. And every once in a while, you go and get some cheese. You know, we cut cheese off a block, and you bring that to them. And, and what would they do? They would just sit around and talk about whatever was going on. It was like the local gossip center of, the community. But this is what happened, just sitting around with nothing else to do except talk to one another about the latest and greatest and this and that, and whether it was politics or their farm or their family or whatever, and they would just talk about everything that was new. That's kind of the picture I get. I mean, I don't know, maybe it's the modern day Saturday morning crowd at Tim Hortons or McDonald's in town. I don't know. But this is what would happen, and they would just talk about everything that was new. Now, I want you to listen carefully then to how Paul, as he's brought to the Areopagus to share that something new with them, I want you to listen carefully to how he frames his presentation of the gospel. This is how he starts. He says to them, so, standing in their midst, he says, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are what? Very religious. It's a charitable statement. It's an acknowledgement of what is just simply true for them. And he says, for as I passed along, as I've been in the city, I observed the objects of your worship. He's paid attention. to what's in their city. He's paid attention to what makes up their worldview. He's paid attention to their culture and to their values and to their beliefs. I noticed this about you. You're very religious. And I've seen all your objects of worship. But as I've looked at them, I also found an altar amongst all of the altars that are in the city with an inscription that says this: to the unknown God. In other words, you have even freely admitted that among all of the altars and shrines and temples and values and beliefs and religiosity, amidst all of it, you just freely admit that you might be missing something. That something or someone might have been omitted or left out. And in some ways, it's an attempt to just cover all of the bases. He says, so what you worship is what you don't know? Well, let me fill in the gap. I'm going to tell you what you're missing. He starts among the culture with a place that they can kind of say, yeah. We get that. We know that altar. We know where it is. Maybe some of them have even, participated in something near that altar. So he starts with something. He's a charitable kind of statement. He says, I've seen what's going on. I know what's happening. And I just want to fill in the gap for you where you've already freely admitted that there's a gap. And he starts this way, verse 24. And he doesn't say, well, in our scriptures in Genesis. No. He just kind of starts with, he's talking to philosophers. So he's going to present what is true in a way that they would listen. So he says there's the God who made the world, so the author and creator of everything, of heaven and earth. This is the God above all gods that you would kind of acknowledge or see. The God who actually made everything, the world and everything in it. Being Lord of heaven and earth, he does not live in temples built by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything. As they, by the way, stand on this mount with all kinds of temples around. Since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. Your very existence, my very existence, every human being's existence depends on this God who made the world and everything in it, who doesn't live in a temple. I'm going to tell you about him. Verse 26, he says, and he made from one man, that is, by the way, who in Genesis? The one man in the beginning, God created, right? Track with me. Okay. Is the air conditioning kind of, okay? In the beginning was Adam, okay? God created Adam, and he says, and from one man, every nation of mankind, right, to live on the face of earth. And having determined the allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place, what is he saying? Look, God is interested in and involved in human affairs right from the very start. And he's determined where each of us live and when we live there. Why? That we would seek God and perhaps we would feel our way toward him and find him. This is like a blind person in the dark, kind of trying to find your way. The other night, I was walking through in the dark in the living room, and I had come in through the door. I'd been out late one evening. Carol and the kids had all gone to bed. I come through the door, I kicked my shoes off. I was walking through what I remembered to be, because it was very dark, the kind of open space in the living room, and right here on my shin, I caught the coffee table, just full stride right into it. And I didn't yell anything, didn't want to wake anybody up, but I just, man, that pained, and I thought, who put the coffee table in the middle? It was always in the middle of the floor, but I ran into that thing full stride, and it's like when you're in the dark, those are the kinds of things that happen. You try to find your way, but man, you're going to bump some stuff and cause damage along the way. And so what is he saying? He says, look, as if that we should seek God and find our way toward him. The idea is, this is the most basic form of searching, that you feel your way as if in the dark. Now the Apostle Paul will say a little bit later on in Romans chapter 1, He doesn't say it here, but just to kind of fill in the gap for us. He says, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. He says, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. In other words, there are things we can know about God just by looking around. There's things that we can know about God and his character just by perceiving through what we see. How does he say? Well, for God's invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. And because of that, we can see those things in what has been made. And so people are without excuse. But then he goes on to say, for although we knew God, we did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But human beings became futile in their thinking, and in their foolish hearts were darkened. And so in that darkness, what does sin do and unrighteousness do? Well, it prevents us from being able to find our way well. It confuses our understanding of things. And in the process, we begin to suppress what is true and what we know just by things we can know of God, just by perceiving through what has been made. But here, Paul is just saying, hey, God has determined all kinds of things, is involved in the world. He set out the boundaries and dwelling places of human beings. What? That we should seek for him and maybe find our way toward him. And he even piggybacks on some of, again, the culture that he understands and knows of the Athenians. This is what he says in the very next verse. He says, yet God is not actually very far from each of us. Because as some of your own poets have said, in him we live and move and have our being. And some of your poets have also said, for we are indeed his offspring. He's quoting things that the Athenians would have known and would have known where they come from. The original reference to actually some of these statements actually is to Zeus. And what Paul is doing is taking some of the literature of the culture, and he says, hey, your poets even have a sense of this in the things that they've written. But what you've attributed to Zeus is actually true of God, that God is the one through whom we live and move and have our being. He's given to all of us life and breath and everything. We are indeed his offspring. And so your own poet, while you have some of the right pieces, they're just put into all the wrong spots. It's kind of like when you try to force a puzzle piece into the wrong place on a puzzle, and it ends up, you don't get a nice picture. And Paul's saying you got some of the right pieces, they're just all in the wrong spots. Verse 29. Verse 29, what does he do? He says, being then God's offspring, we ought not to think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed in the art and imagination of man. Well, what's he like? It's not that God is formed in our image. He actually might be quite different than what you really think. He goes on to say this about that. The times of ignorance, then, God has overlooked. If you're reading in the King James, it says God has winked at. It's not that we are free of responsibility or accountability, but it is that God does not intervene. He allowed things or permitted things to go on. As he says in Romans, God handed them over to their own pursuits and to their own lusts. And so what is the times of ignorance God overlooked, and that he didn't intervene. But now he commands all people everywhere to repent. That is to think different. That results in a change of direction and action. It's to turn from one thing toward another. And God commands everyone to repent because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world. That everybody will be held accountable before their Creator. He will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given full assurance. How can we know that this is true? Well, he raised that man, who is Jesus, from the dead. This is the central event of the gospel. I'm sure some of this is a summary, but he's kind of teased out for them, hey, this Jesus is going to one day come and judge the world, and we will all be held accountable. And how has God proven that that's going to be the case? Well, he's raised him from the dead. And when they heard this phrase, when they heard Paul start talking about Jesus being raised from the dead, when they heard about that resurrection in his message, some of them began to mock. That is, quite literally, to throw out the lip. But others said, we'll hear you again about this. So Paul went out from their midst, but some joined him and believed, among whom also Dionysius the Areopagite and a woman named Damaris and others with them. And so as a result of his preaching, some threw out the lip at Paul. The babbler is babbling. But others believed the message and were persuaded and came to faith. And that's what happened in Athens. So what do we make of this? Well, let me just kind of make a jump quickly for us to our present day. For a large number of people, the gospel is something new. They've never heard it before. And I'm not talking about faraway places that you've never visited. I'm talking about some of your neighbors. Some of the people in our communities. The gospel would be something new. Sociologists would increasingly point to the fact that we live in a post-Christian nation. Whatever Christian nation is, and however we might kind of define what that looks like. I would just say it in this way, that in generations before, there would be a large number of people within our society who would have attended church, who would have been part of religious services, a large number of our people would have been a churched population in Canada. And the Christian faith was probably the most dominant in terms of numbers religion that people would identify with, that I'm a Christian, yes. And so, again, this is just all sociological measure, but we've seen that number shift over a short period of time, actually, but the generations, there has been a shift, and sociologists would say Canada is now a post-Christian nation. In that, not a large number of the population is actually churched or attends church or has any kind of Christian religious devotion. And with that, we have what we call a post-biblical culture. That is, we can no longer assume that people just have a general knowledge of things. And so if you were to say, who was the first man in the beginning, and everybody would look at you going, do I say Adam? Is it Adam? Is that right? I'm just poking now. Okay. But people wouldn't know the story. I mean, ask Carol and ask Paula, ask any of her teachers. If you mention Noah, would they know who that is? If you mention the story of some other Old Testament figure, King David, even to talk about Jesus, a lot of kids and a lot of younger generation people only know the name of Jesus as a cuss word. Who is he anyway, and why should I care? Our understanding, at least culturally, of the scriptures, we are in a post-biblical, we can't just assume there's a general knowledge of what this word says. There's a lot more that we have to explain and a lot more places we have to start from. And not only that, but the questions people are asking have also changed. They are less scientific. Although I think there's been a little bump in that about questions of science and evolution and creation and all of the rest. But the questions that people often ask when it comes to faith are less about science. They're more about social issues. Things like justice. Things like therapeutic pursuits, therapy, how do I be a better person, those kinds of things. How do I deal with my past and trauma and all the things. And so questions about God and faith are less about how do I reconcile with the scientific world and more how do I reconcile with social injustice and therapeutic issues. Those are often a lot more of the questions that you see. And so what Paul does in Athens, I think, is very helpful for us because it teaches us that we have to begin where people are. You'll notice that when he starts in Athens, what he does is he has this holy discontent that burns in him. There's something that burdens him, that he's distressed about, that causes him heartbreak. And what that does is it says, when you feel that, you think somebody's got to do something about that. But what happens and what we see in the way that Paul deals with that holy discontent, that provoked spirit, is he doesn't just come out and criticize the culture and say, you bunch of fools, this is crazy. Look at all this madness. He doesn't do that. It moves him to compassion. to have conversation with people, to say, hey, let's reason this through. Can I ask you a question? Right? That's where it starts. This holy discontent then moves him to look for opportunity in the places where people gather. So it doesn't force him to kind of say, hey, oh man, this city is so, I just can't believe it. I'm just going to sit in my hotel room and pray for everybody until Silas and Timothy get here. No. What does he do? He goes out and he starts to talk to people in the synagogues and the marketplaces. He looks for opportunities. He doesn't isolate himself. He engages with the people around them in looking for those opportunities. And he tries to understand the values and the beliefs and the assumptions and the experiences of people, which requires, by the way, us to ask more questions and to talk less. You ever notice that? If you want to understand someone or something, you have to ask a lot of questions and not just make assumptions. Right? And so that's what he does. He understands the values and beliefs of the culture. And then he is flexible in his approach. Again, we said earlier that when he would go to the synagogue with the Jews, what would he do? He would start with the scriptures. He would start there because there is a common understanding. But when he comes to the Areopagus and he talks to the crowd that's there, what does he do? He starts with, I've looked around and here's what I see and here's the gap and let me explain to you. Right? He starts in a completely different place. And it reminds us that we need to be flexible in our approach. That different people might need a different type of conversation. And so when we come to speak the gospel or to share the gospel, there are opportunities where we can say, hey, what you're talking about reminds me of something that Jesus said. Or what if what you're saying is actually if we saw it differently? What if it was actually like this? So our approach must vary depending on our audience, but there always needs to be a response to call people to take a step or to respond to the message that we preach about Jesus. It's not that we kind of set conviction aside or that the good news of the gospel doesn't come to bear. It's that it comes to bear in a particular way. If we look for an open door in a way that we speak that message into a culture in order to start with where they're at, to begin with where people are, that we might have an open door. And that does not always guarantee, by the way, that your message that you bring, that the things that you say about Jesus will be received well. I mean, we see that here. What happens? Some of them held out the lip, but some believed. And it says at the end of the passage, it says, but some men joined him, as well as the woman, right? But when they heard of the resurrection, so what did Paul do when they said, some mocked, but others said, we'll hear you again about this? So Paul went out from their midst. And there's a time and a moment where we have permission to walk away from the conversation because we've done what we can. And so here's what I would leave us with this morning in terms of some kind of action. I mean, we want to begin where people are when we come to bring the gospel message to bear. We look for opportunities. We try to understand the culture, what provokes us, where can we find an approach? How do we call people to a response? But I think just something helpful for us is if we start in this space, that if we wake up each day and we just start with a simple prayer that goes something like this. Heavenly Father, today I'm available to you. Today I'm available to you. So whatever opportunity there is, whatever conversation I have, whatever, help me to see and to hear and understand. If there's a holy discontent, help me to figure out how to approach that. If there's somebody I know that is on my heart that I need to talk to, or if somebody says something and I think that kind of triggers something in my brain that's like, that reminds me, and this might be an open door. Just, Heavenly Father, today I am available to you. And if there's a person that I can reason with, to bring the good news of the gospel to bear in their life, help me to be obedient to that moment.